Selamat pagi, teman-teman. Mungkin kita sudah
Good
telat.
morning, dear colleague. We are 14 minutes late, so let's just start our seminar this morning. Good morning, Chong Teddy.
Teman-teman sekalian, kita akan
Dear colleagues,
sampai jam 12 kita akan diskusi tentang
from now until
bagaimana
noon,
kita
we
mengintegrasikan
will have a
dan
discussion on
input
how to
tentang
integrate
pro lingkungan dan
the
juga pro gender.
pro-environment
Dan
and
tentu
pro-gender
pro lingkungan
perspective,
dan pro gender tidak ada yang
which is
kontradiksi.
very important because they are not contradictory to each other.
Maaf, dalam perencanaan dan nanti penganggaran ya,
To
untuk
the
kita
planning and budgeting
fungsikan pada saat kita akan diskusi dengan pemerintah. Tentu terutama kepada
during our
para
deliberation with the government.
DPR maupun DPRD yang
And
saat
this is
ini
actually
menjadi
intended
masa-masa penting
for
untuk pembahasan
the member of parliaments
anggaran
and
karena
member of local
kita
parliaments,
mendiskusikannya
since
karena
we are in
selama
a
ini
very
kita sudah
important time
sangat
of the
concern
year, which is
dengan
budget deliberation.
diskurs atau wacana tentang
And I
pro
believe that all of us
equality
are
ataupun pro
very
lingkungan.
familiar with the
Mari bagaimana
discourses on gender
kemudian
and environment,
breakdown it atau
but we need
menurunkannya
to
dalam
break them down
pengambilan keputusan
into
untuk pembahasan fungsi-fungsi politik kita di parlemen
understandings
sebagai MP
to help us in our
ataupun
decision-making
bagi
processes
teman-teman yang
as member of
sebagian dari
parliaments.
kita juga adalah NGO.
And I know that
NGO
some of you
mengambil
are also working
keputusan
in the
juga
NGOs
akan menjadi
who
pegangan. Dan jangan lupa
are safeguarding the
kolaborasi
process.
antara teman-teman yang
And
ada
don't
di dalam
forget, we also have a strong
parlemen,
collaboration
lokal, provinsi
between
maupun
member
nasional
of
dengan
parliaments,
teman-teman yang
both
ada
the
di luar
national
parlemen.
parliaments and the
Karena
subnational parliaments,
karir saya ya
with
itu
the NGOs.
dibantu oleh teman-teman
And
dari
along my
luar
career, I've
parlemen
been
yang
always assisted
punya
by
data, punya kasus yang
NGOs
kemudian bisa dibawa dan
because you guys are the one who have data
teman-teman
and real life cases
saya Eva
that we can
Kusuma
translate
saya
into
board
political
in
decision.
APHR
My name
dan
is
saya
Eva
juga
Kusuma Sundari.
board
I'm a board in
pemerintah
APHR,
kabupaten kota di
and I'm also
KPRI. Kita punya
one of the
KPRI
expert in
di
the
Jawa
Indonesian
yang
Women Parliament's Caucus,
beliau
and we have
juga
the chair
menjadi
of the caucus, Ibu Diah
ketua
Pitaloka,
komisi
who is also the vice chair
yaitu
of
bidang
Standing
sosial,
Committee 8
agama,
on
dan
social, religion,
bencana ya, bencana dan juga perempuan dan
disaster,
anak. Jadi
women, and
minggu
children.
depan
So
pada
our discussion
hari
today
yang
is very
satu ini
relevant
atau 2 minggu ya bahkan KPPRI
because for the
juga
past 2 weeks,
menyelenggarakan
the
berbagai
Women
session ya
Caucus,
berbagai
Women Parliamentary Caucus,
seminar yang
have
membahas
been
isu-isu
organizing
macam-macam.
different seminars
Jadi mungkin
discussing
pada
similar
kesempatan ini Ibu
issues,
Diah bisa
just like our agenda
memperjelas
this morning.
sistem
Maybe
dan
Ibu Diah can also
sistem
share with us some
KPPRI yang
pointers,
sudah
some findings
diselenggarakan dan
of
diselenggarakan
from the
beberapa
series of
kali
discussion
berikut
of
ini di
the Women Caucus
Indonesia.
to commemorate
Dan kita
the
juga punya
EWD International Women's
Teddy, saya
Day.
panggilnya karena dia
We also
juga
have Teddy,
anggota
my
bekas
old friend,
parlemen juga dari
also a
Philippines.
former MP
Ini
from the
adalah
Philippines,
direktur eksekutif
and
dari
he is now the
ASEAN
executive director
Parliamentarians for Human Rights
of the
yang
APHR.
baru launching, bukan baru 3 bulan yang lalu launching manifesto untuk
And we
mewujudkan
just launched our
kebijakan
manifesto 3
kebijakan
months
untuk
ago
merespon adanya COVID-19.
to make sure
Tentu
that the public policies in
sesuatu
response of
kebutuhan
COVID-19
atas
is in
kebutuhan yang
line
luar biasa
with the
kritis
needs
diakibatkan oleh pandemi ini.
brought by
Sampai
the
pengambilan
drastic
keputusan,
changes
penyusunan anggaran,
brought by
perencanaan
these
anggaran
changes in this pandemic,
seolah-olah
because we don't
seperti
want
sebelum
the
COVID.
budget
Dan
and
terutama
planning
adalah
process
isu tentang
that will
bantuan
take
bantuan
place
yang
will remain the
menimpa
same just like before the pandemic,
ya istilahnya apa yang
especially for women and children who are
sangat terpukul,
disproportionately affected
sangat
by
menjadi
this
korban dari
pandemic.
adanya pandemi ini. Dan tentu kita juga belajar selama pandemi
And of course, we
problem
also
sosial
learn
itu harus menjadi mainstreaming juga.
during the
Tidak hanya soal
pandemic,
perempuan, soal anak,
environment
soal
issue should
lingkungan.
always be mainstream
Setelah COVID nanti,
so
kebijakan
that
publiknya
after
stabilitas,
COVID-19,
tapi juga dia
our
bisa mengulangi
public
satu
policy
kesalahan
can be more
karena
crisis resilient,
terhadap
and we
lingkungan
should
maupun
not repeat the
dengan
past
permohonan.
mistake
Nah, itu.
that
Di
was caused
sesi
by
berikutnya lebih
gender
teknis
bias or
dan lebih
environmental bias.
program proyek
The
yang
next
sesuai
session,
konsep. Itu kita akan punya 4
which is more
narasumber
technical,
yang
we will
sangat
have four
semuanya teman-teman
well-known resource
ini
persons.
sangat
We
hebat
handpick them
karena background beliau-beliau ini.
carefully because of
Yang
their
pertama
background.
adalah Pak Syarif Laude. Pak Syarif
The
Laude
first
ini
one is Mr. Sharif Laude,
komisioner
former
dan pengetahuannya
Anti-Corruption
sangat
Commission commissioner,
luar biasa, semua
and he
KPK
has vast
human
knowledge
resource ya,
on
bagaimana KPK
natural
itu
resources.
dan beliau mempunyai beberapa rekomendasi yang penting untuk para pengambil keputusan terutama para politisi untuk memastikan agar pro lingkungan menjadi perspektif. Kita juga punya Mbak Yunita Purnama, Public Service International, beliau dari Public Service International.
The second one is Unita from Public Services
Bagaimana
International,
misi kita pada pagi hari ini
who
supaya
will
profesional
actually
dan juga supaya technocratic sounds atau bisa
which will actually help us to make sure that our understanding can be translated into
terutama di
sound
penganggaran
public policies.
perencanaan dan penganggaran pembangunan. Ada Mas Wahyu Susilo, ini long time friend ya, dari
And we also
saya
have Wahyu
sejak
Susilo, my longtime friend,
1992. Aduh maaf ya, saya sebagai moderator lupa
since
mengingatkan
1992. And I also forget
supaya
to remind you
nanti terutama apabila Chong Teddy, Pak Teddy akan
about the interpretation
menyampaikan dalam
feature.
bahasa Inggris, teman-teman bisa setting itu di
So
ada
when
dua
Teddy
tiga itu ya di
speaks in English
keyboard
later,
nanti
there are three dots in
bisa
your
digeser ya ke
cell
dalam
phone,
bahasa Indonesia.
and
Ini hanya
select
untuk pemahaman
interpretation
saja.
and
Bisa Mas
select
Mas
Indonesian
Akmal karena semua
just during
narasumbernya
Teddy's speech.
untuk
But for the rest, don't
di
worry
Indonesia
because
sehingga
we have
akan bisa membantu
choose all
teman-teman
of
yang
the resource persons
komunikasinya
from
kurang.
Indonesia, so it'll be
Dan
easier for you to follow the discussion.
Mas Wahyu Susilo ini adalah direktur
Wahyu
Migrant Care,
Susilo
Migrant Care,
is a director
organisasi
at
yang
Migrant
mengurus
Care. Migrant
penanaman
Care
modal
is an
asing di luar negeri
organization
dan
working
tentu dampaknya ke Indonesia
with
ya
Indonesian
karena
migrant
beliau
workers.
juga ngurusin isu-isu minoritas seperti TKI di luar negeri dan tentu juga kebijakan-kebijakan hulu di dalam negeri tentu PRT kita
So they
untuk
also
investasi dalam
work
dan keluar negeri.
with policies
Tetapi juga ada
in Indonesia,
isu-isu
especially on migrant
tentang
workers and
pengungsi.
migration.
Kita sudah
But at the
tahu
same
bahwa
time, they also
Papua
work
mendapatkan konflik
with
itu
refugees.
berdampak
We
kepada
understand that
input ya
we have,
yang kemudian harus kita
when we have
kita
conflict in
cek
Myanmar,
ya apakah
usually
kita
we have
kira-kira penerima dari
both
pengungsi atau
people.
transit, kebanyakan transit. Juga isu-isu minoritas yang lain yang kelewat oleh kebijakan selama menangani krisis maupun selama menyiapkan pemulihan seperti misalkan kelompok anak jalanan. Kemudian juga
So they also work
kemudian
with
LGBT
different
saya
issues,
banyak
including
tidak
street children,
tapi teman-teman yang usia
LGBTQ,
udah tua nggak dipilih nggak ada pengambil
transgender.
kebijakan.
We need to
Nah
take care
ini
of them,
gimana juga manula. Nah itu
and
jadi
also
ya
senior
harus
citizens.
memastikan kita
So
sensitif dan
Wahyu
responsif terhadap
works
isu-isu
to
the
ensure
voiceless
that
orang yang
we are sensitive to the
invisible
voiceless,
ya oleh pengambil keputusan
those
ini
who
pada
are
pagi hari ini
invisible
kita
to
harapkan
decision
beberapa
makers.
politisi
And
perempuan
this
dipilih
morning,
yang
we hope
kemudian
that the
mengangkat mereka supaya menjadi
women politician
analisis di dalam pengambilan
can
keputusan.
bring them to the
Mereka
surface
ini
and
adalah
consider them in the decision making process,
minoritas. Nah, minoritas ini
because
seperti apa?
we've always
Yang
been
terakhir kita
only
punya Mbak
looking
Tisa
at the
Mafira. Mbak Tisa
majority.
Mafira ini
And the
dari
last one is Tisa Mafira.
jabatannya adalah Associate Director untuk Climate Change
She is the
Policy
Associate Director
Initiatives.
for
Luar
Climate Change
biasa,
Policy
kita
Initiatives.
sangat familiar
So
dengan
we are very
isu-isu
familiar
climate change
with
ini.
climate change
Tapi
issues,
bagaimana
which are
mengintegrasikan
very important.
perspektif ini ke
But
dalam
the question is
pengambilan
how to integrate
keputusan
this
publik.
perspective
Itu
in public decision
kira-kira
making processes.
perjalanan kita pada pagi hari ini sampai dengan
So that's
siang
all
dan sebagai pengantar saya
our
akan
agenda for
menjelaskan
today.
ada
And
saya
by way of
narasumber
introduction, we also have the
Joy
women
ya.
Indonesian Parliamentary Caucus as the co-host, together with Asian Parliamentary Human Rights Network. So this, so this is a Women Parliamentary Caucus with MPs as members, both MPs at the national and subnational level. The chair is Dia Pitaloka from PDIP party. APHR is also a caucus consisting of MPs from ASEAN countries, and you can also be our associates at the local level, and we can work together to follow up on this meeting. After this meeting, you can contact me, and we can help to inform you working on issues at the national and local level.
dan bisa menjadi associate partner dari APHR. APHR ini didirikan tahun 2014.
APHR was established in 2014, but prior to that, we have the Parliamentary Caucus for Myanmar, which was established in 2006. So this organization is quite senior. I was the executive director. Sorry, not executive director, the chair, the president of IPMC and the president of APHR. So without further ado, let's prepare ourselves to listen to the introduction, which will be delivered by Teddy Baguilat. And please use the interpretation feature, but for those of you who understand English, you don't need to switch to English channel. Thank you for the translators. Yeah.
So, Kontagi, the floor is yours. You may speak in maximum 15 minutes to say hi to everybody, and also maybe a little bit elaborate the what APHR is, and also the manifesto that we had. Go ahead, John Teddy.
Thank you, Ibu Eva. To our dear participants, honorable members of the Parliament of Indonesia, their staff members, and our partners from civil society, welcome and thank you very much for joining this event, which is co-organized by the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights and the Women's Caucus of the Parliament of Indonesia. I am Teddy Baguilat Jr. I am a former member of Parliament from the Philippines, and currently I am the interim executive director of APHR. Well, Ibu Eva has already elaborated on APHR, but I'd just like to say that we are a regional network of current and former members of Parliament who maximize our mandates, our positions as MPs, and our public persona to advocate human rights and democracy throughout the region, inside and outside of the Parliament. So how do we do this? We work closely with civil society, and that's why many of them are invited in this forum. We do fact-finding missions, and we give recommendations, papers to parliamentarians to help them in their advocacy, as well as publish media, public statements on the most important issues affecting the region. And today, we are meeting to discuss how parliamentarians in Indonesia can promote measures to ensure a sustainable and just economic recovery from COVID-19 in Indonesia. And this will be the first in a series of national meetings which we'll be hosting in this year. And later this year, because COVID-19, of course, is a regional problem, cuts across all countries in Southeast Asia, we will also have meetings with members of the Parliament from Thailand and Malaysia. Okay. So from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the grave implications of this crisis for human rights have been clear. In addition to its wide-ranging impacts on the rights to health, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on the region's economy. Business operations have closed down, food supply chains have been disrupted. There's mass unemployment. Economic indicators have really been affected. Exchange rates have depreciated. The pandemic, more importantly, also revealed major existing inequalities and weaknesses in our governance systems, with the region failing to protect those in the most vulnerable positions. For example, it has illustrated the gendered impacts of such crisis. And we are particularly very pleased to be partnering with the Women's Caucus of the Parliament of Indonesia to highlight the gender dynamic of this crisis and its recovery. Finally, the pandemic has also illustrated the roots of this emergency in our unsustainable economic system. Indeed, climate change and deforestation are key contributors to the rising number of epidemics that we are seeing today. From the beginning of the crisis, we have been advocating to parliamentarians in Southeast Asia to ensure that human rights are respected and protected during the pandemic, but also crucially in the recovery packages and measures from the crisis. Joining forces with MPs from across the region, in November of last year, we issued a parliamentary manifesto on the COVID-19 economic recovery and human rights, which was signed by more than 60 MPs across the region. And I do hope that some of you were able to sign on to this manifesto. Right now, we are moving to our second phase of our advocacy to focus more on measures that can be taken at the national level. So today, we are gathered to focus on Indonesia across three areas in particular: climate change, the rights of marginalized persons, and the rights of workers, and the need to boost opportunities of decent employment. Concerning climate change, we now know that Indonesia, but not just Indonesia, but all of Southeast Asia, is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. You can see here a map of the areas in Southeast Asia, which are expected to be underwater by 2050, which is in just 30 years due to the sea level rise. In addition to this, climate change, but also other forms of environmental degradation, such as deforestation, have a critical impact on creating epidemics such as COVID-19. For this reason, it is absolutely imperative that the economic recovery from COVID-19 does not take place at the expense of our environment and of meeting our objectives to the Paris Agreement on climate change. Despite this, most recovery packages from the pandemic have taken place at the expense of the environment, notably our forests, as tree cover losses have increased by 77% globally as countries push for the exploitation of resources to boost their economy. This is particularly problematic for a country like Indonesia, which is, and I'm sorry to say this, but Indonesia, according to the international scientific community, is still not on track to meet the objective of the Paris Agreement on climate change, and whose efforts are still regarded as highly insufficient. Concerning marginalized persons, it is imperative to increase their long-term protection from future crises. Previous crises have proven that countries with strong health and social protection systems suffer less and recover faster. Social protection programs increase economic resilience, help prevent poverty and unemployment, and are very powerful economic and social stabilizers that can contribute to a swift economic recovery. It is therefore critical to ensure that economic stimulus measures can enhance health and social protection while integrating the various needs of individuals such as women and migrants to help the region recover faster. And finally, concerning workers' rights and employment, COVID-19 response measures have led to mass unemployment, drop in income, and a spike in poverty and suicide rate among workers. It also highlighted how some workers were most affected by the crisis, such as women, migrants, and those working in the informal economy. Yet we all agree on this, the healthy and resilient workforce is the backbone of an effective economic recovery. Therefore, Parliamentarians must act to ensure that economic recovery packages boost employment and protect all workers from the impacts of the economic recession, in particular by supporting women's equal participation and protection in the workforce. So without much further ado, I leave the floor to the speakers and welcome you all again, our participants, and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much tadi Chong tadi dan seperti yang sudah kita dengar tadi
as we've heard before,
banyak yang kelewat ya dari isu-isu minoritas itu
many of the minority issues were missing, including disabilities issue and also environmental issue are missing in the pandemic response because this also has intergenerational impact. So if our policy is pro-minority, we hope that the social justice for all Indonesians can be materialized. What about at the parliament at the national level? Because they play very pivotal role in deciding the budget, because the national budget will also impact the local budget. So now let's hear from Ibu Dia Pitaloka,
menggunakan kesempatan ini saya pikir saya klaim sebagai wakil pimpinan atau menjadi pimpinan dan
who will also speak on behalf of or in her position as the Vice Chair of Standing Committee 6. Thank you, Eva. Good morning, everyone. Chong Teddy, good morning. Thank you for this event. There will be many topics that we can discuss going into the future. This is actually our first collaboration between APHR and the Indonesian Women Parliamentary Caucus. And we hope that this room can be a forum for us to exchange views and information as well as knowledge. So hopefully in the future, this can facilitate cooperation among parliamentarians in Southeast Asia, since all of us belong to the same region and we are facing same issues. And we also hope that these issues can also be raised in different summits and high-level meetings in Southeast Asia. This morning, we just commemorate the International Women's Day, where the Indonesian Women Parliamentary Caucus tried to open a discussion with every commission in the parliament on issues regarding women and gender inequality. So this is actually organized together with a photo exhibition of women parliamentarians, because women issues is always seen as the work of Commission 8. But when we try to dissect this further, we found that there are many issues on gender equalities that can be found in different commission. For instance, in Commission 1, we found that access of women to internet and to information technology in general is still lacking. We believe that aside from education and literacy, access to data or to quota is also very important. And we believe that women now plays very important role in education, and they also need data and information technology to communicate among each other. In Commission 2, we discussed about the role of women in the local governance. So we need to have more or richer perspectives in the local government. to make sure there are strategic roles reserved for women in the local government. But we hope here we not only have uh, women, a more role of women qualitatively, but also quantitatively. We also want to see more head of regions, female head of regions. For Commission 3, we in Indonesia recently passed an omnibus law for job creation. We hope that we can also see this new law in gender perspective or gender lenses. Next one is green energy, which is very relevant with the topic that was presented by Teddy. Our speaker yesterday, Mercy Baran, said that people have to produce oil for lighting for 8 hours a day. So they spend so much time because of this energy disparity. So women is also disproportionately affected in this energy crisis and energy disparity, especially in remote area. The next one is actually development of underdeveloped villages, and also the issue of early age marriage. And we believe that the dispensation article in our marriage law has created new trend. We have many early age marriage because of this dispensation. So we hope that the government can come up with practical policies or practical guidelines to make sure that this dispensation process is not that easy to be done. Because the next one is about vaccine. We are trying to ensure that the vulnerable groups have access to the vaccine for all. Not only we want to make sure the safety and accessibility of a vaccine, and the next one, we also discuss about gender sensitive budget. So we need to review our gender approach in budgeting process. We've seen some progresses, but the gap between human development index between men and women is still quite significant, and the improvement of HDI for women is also still lagging, which is a reflection of a deep-rooted problems in our budget construction and policy constructs. Because once we are hit by the crisis, this disparity problem can be found in all aspects of life and policies. So I don't know whether this is a problem of paradigm. I don't know whether maybe people don't see this as a priority, but still we have a strong disparity in the gender framework, and this becomes apparent when the crisis hit us, which made us realize that the problem still exists. I also would like to highlight one law that is being deliberated, law on disaster management. Seems to be like a technical law, but if we further dissect the law, this law actually brought us back to see environmental degradation due to poor spatial planning.
dianggap sebagai alasan utama, tapi juga kerusakan yang ditimbulkan kayak misalnya deforestasi gitu ya.
and also the destruction due to deforestation,
Atau memang tidak tersedianya ruang-ruang hijau di daerah-daerah perkotaan.
and also the
Memang hal-hal yang
inavailability
sepele,
of
tapi
green
ternyata
spaces
banyak sekali kalau kemarin
in urban area.
daerah Jawa Utara itu banyak disebabkan misalnya adanya pendangkalan sungai, lalu juga
And also there are
yang tidak menyiapkan satu
flooding in the northern part of Java because of poor spatial planning and poor environmental management.
lingkungan itu tidak hanya menyangkut
And when we talk about environmental degradation here, we are also talking about destruction in human lives.
lalu juga bagaimana kita
The next one,
kelompok-kelompok rentan.
we also need to pay attention to vulnerable groups, women, children,
Nah, ini dari satu
and
bidang kemudian kita bisa banyak sekali mereview pendekatan
marginalized communities.
kebijakan gender gitu
So
ya,
we need to review gender policies
dari berbagai aspek ketimpangan gender sehingga
and gender disparity policies. So when addressing
harus menjadi satu
a
satu
problem,
keyword gitu sebetulnya
we should always use gender lens
review atau melakukan
whenever we review or construct
ataupun kebijakan.
legislation or any policies in this case. So, Jong tadi mentioned earlier about the integration of various aspects. Well, indeed,
Persoalan ketimpangan ini yang saya
the reflection of disparity issue. This is something that I would like to highlight in our meeting this morning. The issue of disparity here today, not only about economic disparity, because now we want to build a more structural economy, but here we also have more substantive disparity, including social disparity with wider implications, including not only in welfare distribution of welfare, but also distribution of justice. So it is still very apparent nowadays on how our system have deep-rooted disparity.
Apabila narasi-narasi atau banyak sekali teori-teori yang sudah menunjukkan bahwa ada perbaikan yang
And there are many theories that show that we have improvement in the world situation, but once we were hit by the pandemic, it actually highlights that we still have many homework left, and this pandemic becomes a reflection on how the problem still exists among us. That's all from me. Hopefully we can go deep.
punya solusi-solusi walaupun mungkin di ruang-ruang kecil tapi solusi-solusi
If, even though these are in smaller
berada dalam jalan perjuangan
spaces, but I hope that we are working towards the same goals. Thank you and greetings.
Waalaikumsalam, Bu Tia. Teman-teman semakin apa ya konteks.
Thank you, Ibu Dia. The context of our discussion becomes clearer now.
Integrating perspektif pro gender equality dan juga pro lingkungan itu apa PR yang cukup berat.
How we still have
apa ngonangi ya kalau orang Jawa itu apa menengarai mengidentifikasi ternyata draft-draft legislasi itu masih apa
a very strong gender problem
adalah bias non perempuan dan anak dan kelompok-kelompok minoritas lain. Jadi PR untuk politisi perempuan itu luar biasa.
So the homework for female politicians are incredible because what has been missed out from our policies are things that we need to fight for, and that is why we need to gather into an organization and strengthen.
Jatim sudah berdiri ya Bu ya?
Belum Mbak, belum.
The Women's Caucus in the Parliament. Hopefully if we have a provincial office, We can also have lower level organizations. So other people like Mr. Kosia, she consulted with me that we have the local midterm development plan.
Ya, karena RPJMD itu kayak payung, Bu. Tapi itu menjadi komitmen moral. Tapi
Can
komitmen
be a moral commitment, a political commitment. The fact that we can have programs and projects. And we can talk about the how-tos, the technicalities, and how to bring down from moral commitments to political commitments. And hopefully we
untuk mendanai di pengeluaran-pengeluaran ya, di sisi pengeluaran
for spending, to fund the various issues that we've identified into a budget statement that we can execute in the field in the form of projects that can solve issues. For the second round, talking about the how part, I would like to invite Mr. Laudi Sharif. He's now the executive director at Partnership. I'm also coincidentally a board member, and we have interact.
Beliau akan mengkombinasikan pengalaman-pengalaman di
and he will combine the experiences that he acquired as a KPK commissioner, the Corruption Eradication Commission, but also his experience being the executive director at Partnership to tackle climate change issues. He's a Australian graduate.
Kita bisa dibantu oleh beliau. 15 menit ya, Pak.
And environmental science. So 15 minutes, Pak Laude. Thank you. Thank you, Mbak Eva, Ibu Dia, other colleagues, resource persons. I feel grateful to be given the opportunity to share this morning.
Sebenarnya Bu Eva ini bos saya di kemitraan, jadi saya harus baik-baik sama Bu Eva.
Ibu Eva is actually my boss in Partnership, so I have to be careful in speaking. Don't divulge any secrets here, sir. But we want to share a little bit about how to ensure environmental protection can be included in budget and laws. So not just the law on the environment, but also the thinking
terperhatikan, maka seharusnya itu
the environment be paid attention to. This is something that we actually need to have in different legislations. I think all of you who are in the parliament, you understand better about the legislative processes as well as budgeting, but I would like to share a little bit. We really need to be grateful to God Almighty, Amnesty International. They're thinking that everyone should enjoy the right to a healthy environment. They're asking so that a right to a healthy environment can be part of a human right.
Alhamdulillah ini bukan lagi sesuatu yang kita minta. Dan memang konstitusi kita itu saya pikir sangat
Constitution is quite advanced already. If we look at the Constitution of the US or the UK or Germany, right to a healthier environment is not included in their constitution. We have, however, the constitution of like South Africa and other countries who have included these things. So this is a constitutional mandate that we have to implement. And whatever we become,
baik itu di parlemen maupun di eksekutif maupun di yudikatif. Nah, jadi
wherever we sit in the executive branch, legislature, or the judiciary. So the Constitution provides us with the right of all citizens to a good and healthy environment, and that is why it is the responsibility of us all to see through that in budgeting and legislation. The negative effects of
atau mungkin saya takut salah.
the environment. Sometimes the Constitution says one thing, but the operations in the field are not as we can read in the statutes, the accepted policy. This is one example, a painful example. This was in 2020, 2021. From Sumatra or Bogor or South Kalimantan, we've seen many people displaced, or last year, up to 5,000 people displaced. There's also the Cyclop Mount in Papua. There were some avalanches. Now, is this the fault of policy or the statutes? Or maybe it is our fault?
Menurut yang disampaikan oleh Presiden, kalau yang terjadi di
What we've seen in South Kalimantan last time, I cannot remember how many trillion rupees, but it reached trillions. The Cyclop as well, in other locations as well. This is only due to flooding. Because I was asked by Ibu Eva to talk about something that is related regarding how the clauses are included into the legislation and budgeting. Then I like to say that this is just to remind you that our laws is quite good. So the system and the procedures,
atau legislasi. Misalnya itu dikatakan
legislative product, it is stated that
undang-undang itu harus dilengkapi
every law needs to be
kecuali RUU anggaran pendapatan
accompanied by an academic paper, especially for or except for a government regulation in lieu of law. So there has to be academic papers. And furthermore, the academic paper must include all elements, including the philosophical basis, judicial basis.
pun tidak dalam pasal 3 ini tidak disebutkan
And in Article 3, it is not mentioned specifically ecological or environmental basis, but in its philosophy, because there is the right to a healthy environment of all of the citizens. So philosophically, we have to include that
Jadi sebelum kita
in the academic paper. So we cannot be tardy. Sometimes environmental considerations are not included in draft bills. When we talk about sociological basis or considerations, we need to include environmental calculations there as well.
ada hal sebenarnya Jadi tuh saya tuh
There's
sebenarnya
something else.
lingkungan kita itu seharusnya tidak boleh juga sering kita menyalahkan peraturan perundang-undangan.
We really cannot just blame statutes, but many problems occur in the implementation aspect. We have Government Regulation number 46 of 2017 regarding the Environmental Economic Instrument. This is the mandate of law number 32 of 2009, Article 43 regarding the protection and management of the environment. What is mentioned or set out in this government regulation? The Environmental Economic Instrument is the controlling instrument that guarantees the realization of accountability and legal order to change the mindset and the behavior of stakeholders, and promotes funding that is accountable, measurable, and trustworthy by the public and the international community. This international economic instrument at the moment has not covered all of the government programs. This has
cakupannya sebagai bagian dari implementasi Undang-Undang Lingkungan Hidup.
Economic instrument that is part of the implementation of the environmental management law. So what we need to have is at the parliament and in the government, this environmental economic instrument. We talked about the circular economics. We've talked about the importance of different types of developments. So we need to realize this in law and legislation and in budgeting. I would like to give you some examples of the different types of economic instruments. We have the natural resources balance. So this is something that the government has to come up with. We don't have that yet, but now we're surprised because before that was created, we saw the omnibus law being passed. So it is as though environmental considerations were set aside. Also, the environmental services. I can't go into every one of these, but let me go into some specifics from the list.
Dalam perhitungan biaya produksi atau biaya
Penalization. These are things that are included in the production cost or business cost. This is something that we often forget, intentionally or unintentionally. So the environment incurs a cost, and we need to internalize them so that we can understand easier. I'll give you an example. The internalization of environmental costs. In some other countries, this is in Europe, especially for transportation, what are the things that are included in this internalization? For example, accidents. What happens when there are accidents? Or maybe noise caused by the vehicles or air pollution.
perubahan iklim. Selanjutnya bagaimana itu mengganggu alam.
Contributions to climate change. Maybe it disrupts nature, or maybe it has impacts on urban effects. And what happens to the upstream processes? So every type of vehicle, they can have the different externalities, internalizations as well. For example, motorcycles, also heavy-duty vehicles, those that are from 3.5 to 40 tons. And then there's the low-duty vehicles. Because the environmental effects are different, and we need to be able to measure them. this part in our country, this is not something that we've undertaken, but we have to make these calculations. Going back to the very sad images, the floodings and all that. Whenever we issue licenses, permits for the opening of mining or plantations, have we?
Secara nomor ya, bukan kita sudah berpikir ini bahwa
And
ternyata kalau kita bandingkan
we think that maybe when we compare
tambang yang ada di Kalimantan Selatan yang berkontribusi
the number of mining that contribute to the flooding in South Kalimantan, how much tax do they pay, and the royalties that they pay compared to the destructions that they caused. I am afraid that what we could have is greater damage compared to the economic stimulus or incentive. So we need, I only understand the legal part, but our economists need to pay attention to this. And I think the Parliament, Ibu Dia, you need your troops there in the Parliament to calculate this. This is just one example. This is just about vehicles. But we need to pay attention to the different permits and licenses that we.
Ini adalah contoh internalisasi CSR di dalam penganggaran.
This is an example of CSR in budgeting. It is rare that we can find a obligation for CSRs with our law, especially for extractive industries. In our company law, there is what is called a CSR, but the management is not something that we can see in real life on a daily basis. There is what is called the capital budgeting. And then there's the value creation of the main project. And then the cost benefit analysis. And then make sure that in cost benefit analysis, there's the cost, there's also benefit, including negative externalities. So the pollution, maybe it's the waste is channeled to the river. How much would that cost? How much damage would that incur? We need to calculate the negative externalities. And what happens to the CSR? We need to match the CSR with the negative externalities. Maybe people say that I've undertaken CSR. I contributed for the food during the celebrations of the Independence Day. Is that related at all to the negative externalities that people should be addressing? And then we can go into the economic.
Kita harapkan. Oleh karena itu di dalam penganggaran
And therefore, in modern budgeting, we have to internalize environmental cost. We can't have it to be zero. Meanwhile, if it's destroyed, there's a lot of cost that we'll have to pay to recover it. Ibu Dia mentioned something about a particular statute that we have to create. For example, the volcanic eruptions of Sinabung and Merapi, nobody can control that or decide that because it's only known to God Almighty. Maybe we can predict, oh, I think it's nearing its eruption again. But for flooding, this is something that we can actually prevent. So there could be an obligation For concession holders, permit holders, they have to, for example, set aside some funds as a guarantee. When I was in a KPK, from the 10,000 more mining concessions, those that have set aside some funds for reclamation are only 1,500. So if we have the different mining pits still open after operation and people falling into them, that's actually common because this is business as usual. And even after that, there are many different issues that occur. Money set aside is actually to guarantee that they can reclaim the pits if they pay
sampai modern seperti Eropa tadi itu ya. Tetapi
too modern, like in Europe, but just implement our current provisions. I'm sure that we can reduce the instances of floodings. So we have to go from traditional budgeting, we have to move to a better budgeting. If possible, maybe we can even have advanced budgeting. We also have what is called beyond budgeting, where 1 rupiah is calculated in its effect. So for every rupiah, we calculate the effects on the environment and welfare of people. Yeah, we need to move in that direction. I'm showing you the economic instruments that we have available in our country, something that is also written by Indonesians here, including what we have here, TISA. I don't think I need to explain or ask her about this, the different environmental economic instruments that we have. I will conclude by saying and by reminding you something that was mentioned by this person that I really respect.
menciptakan sumber daya
Nature or God created these things with natural resources that are sufficient enough, but it will not be enough for any man's greed. Thank you and may peace be upon you.
Terima kasih Pak Laude.
Thank you, Pak Laude.
Pesimistik tapi juga ada
This is rather pessimistic, but also posing a challenge. So he mentioned to us, explained to us why we have floodings. Because when we make decisions, publish licenses and concessions, we don't think about the excesses. We need to be able to include those excesses. If you are flying and you want to land in Bangka, you'll see all the pits. Or maybe you hear the news, there's flooding in Merauke. That is so weird because that should not happen. That is bizarre. There are different effects of development that then would have to be borne by people who are not consumers or users of those or beneficiaries of those services, but everyone. When I was
lingkungan yang bisa dibawa ke P21 gitu tuh enggak ada.
cases that would be able to be prosecuted successfully, I was really upset with the local police. At the time, I was in Kalimantan, and I asked them, why can't we have successful prosecutions? The Jambi police chief created some breakthroughs. They took the heavy equipment. Some of them were also used by small-scale, smallholder mining operations. What I told them, not just them, but also big companies as well, saying, we will be patient, we are moving in that direction. So people who are advocating for this should be able to undertake some breakthroughs so that our colleagues in the parliament can raise these issues and say that, hey, the permits and licenses
kebijakan untuk mengantisipasi dan juga mungkin untuk mengkompensasi
to compensate the effects and the damages. That is the political question, I guess. And the meeting, so we have agenda or questions that we have in our working meetings, either at the national level or at the local level. We will continue, and I hope we can have even more complementary information. Now, I'd like to invite Mbak Yunita to equip us, our parliamentary colleagues, so that they can talk and investigate and pursue and come up with solutions and ideas. Like Pak Laude has stated before, because you have issued the licenses and not taking into account the potential excesses, this is my recommendation. So this is something that just to not only raise issues, but also to offer or to recommend ways forward. So parliamentarians need to understand the prevailing laws and to make mention of those things in our sessions. Ibu atau Mbak Junita?
Oke, udah kelihatan ya?
Udah Mbak
I hope you can
Juliana.
see what's on screen.
Nah, setelah
Itu ASEAN seluruh negara Asia Tenggara.
ya sudah mempersilahkan saya untuk bisa menjadi pembicara di dalam
Thank you
agenda
for
ini.
inviting me to speak.
Pada hari ini saya mewakili
Today,
PSI Public Service International akan membahas
I am representing Public Services International,
pemulihan ekonomi.
and I will be speaking about how economic packages, recovery packages can support adequate. Excuse me.
Kalau yang hari Senin hari Senin ya, yang hari Senin tuh pelatihan di Hotel Sekedar.
Iya.
Berapa nomornya?
Kawan-kawan, sebenarnya kalau kita melihat pandemi COVID ini sebenarnya sudah
The
mengungkap
COVID pandemic has
yang sifatnya neoliberal pada saat ini.
exposed the deficiencies of today's neoliberal economic model. There's a lot of uncertainties in terms of disease, spread, and there's privatization and also stopping of public funding has caused many different services, including health, to become inaccessible. How can we have optimal services for the public when people who are running those health businesses pursue profit at the same time and try to maximize profit? Because of this approach, businesses are also trying to achieve a very low production cost. But by reducing cost, no matter what,
Kan berbagai macam hal. Contohnya tadi yang seperti Pak Laude sudah bicarakan, untuk mengejar
we end up sacrificing other things such as what was mentioned by Palaude. You sacrifice the environment and other important stakeholders in the production process. This neoliberal approach has failed to bring us together to stop the pandemic, but has actually facilitated some businesses to become even bold to pursue profit that has created even greater inequality and disparity the world over. The COVID recovery plan designed so that every person can receive healthcare. Second is to provide them with employment. COVID has had a disproportionate impact on the workforce, on laborers. Many people have lost their jobs or received reduced or even no payment. The recovery is designed to make our
hal ini harus diperhitungkan di dalam
and to
rencana
create a society that is more fair, more democratic, more connected, and more resilient. But in order to achieve that, we need a fundamental change on the protection of workers' rights and national and global economic arrangements so that every person can receive healthcare. We need to improve the health system. Healthcare for all is the best antidote. The current economic system has caused the situation where some health services to only be accessible by certain people. For example, some people are prioritized in receiving vaccinations, even though there's no particular reason for them to be prioritized.
Untuk meningkatkan sistem kesehatan, maka kita sebenarnya membutuhkan tenaga kesehatan.
To recover our health, of course, we need health workers. And the pandemic shows that we are lacking in the number of health workers in the country. We have 18 million health workers in Asia. And to improve the number of
HIIG ini adalah
apply the 10 recommendations of the high-level commission on employment and economic growth.
Kita bisa rekomendasi bagaimana kita bisa meningkatkan kualitas tenaga kesehatan.
They have issued some recommendations to improve services and economic growth, including the transformation of the health sector. To achieve that transformation, we need to have incentives for the health workers. It would be impossible for us to recruit or even maintain the current staff if we don't pay them due appreciation.
Memberikan insentif ini juga cukup baik dan ini harusnya dipertahankan. Dan tentunya insentif ini tidak hanya berupa
the incentives not only can be in the form of money, but also education, as well as other aspects to this transformation. Again, how can we fund primary care rather than depend upon the current hospital system? We need to be focused on how we can provide essential care, and disease prevention. And then, with regards to our healthcare system, there is a high probability of migration of
Indonesia untuk bisa memastikan di tengah pandemi ini
by the WHO. So we need to have better management and regulation to prevent this migration, to ensure we can have a sufficient number of healthcare workers in the country to resolve the pandemic. Another thing that we also have to do is to overturn inequality. COVID-19 pandemic has a lot of effects on many countries in terms of human security. We see that the key is public services. We see that unionizing can be a tool to reduce disparity. The workers have a large role to play in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery, and we need to have better guarantees of their rights. And we can see in many cases, unionizing can actually improve the quality of public services.
Negara-negara yang memiliki rasio sektor publik dia yang memfokuskan
that countries that focus on or prioritize the public sector, they turn out to have better performance in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And conversely, there are disadvantages in prioritizing private services. So we need to provide better protection, including social security and gender equality. So the rights that we need to protect must be, especially it needs to be protected, especially those who are working in the public sector, and they serve to be the key to the COVID-19 economic recovery. Other things that we need to consider is decarboning the economy. So we need an equitable transition, especially for workers and impacted communities. And that is why we all need regulations to have the transitions. To go back to this agenda,
medical workers atau mungkin tim SAR atau mungkin pemadam kebakaran itu adalah
we need
sangat
to
penting.
also build up and enhance our emergency services and to ensure that we can guarantee people who are taking part in these emergency services. The ILO has published guidelines to do this, and we can refer to that document. The public goods that can be used for decarboning, like energy, water, emergency services, social services, and transportation, unfortunately have been taken over by the private sector, but they are important, and we need greater investments in that area, as well as climate change funding in all dimensions. Now, with regards to human security and the protection of workers' rights. This is not something that can be seen at the moment. So we need this failed economic system to be changed. Indonesia needs to enhance the investments and support to its public sectors that can be under the control of the state. There are a few things that can be used as reference, including that we need to reconfigure the trade regulations for public interest. Since we have now mainly free trade agreements, there is a race to the bottom, not going to the top of welfare, but affecting a major reduction in the level of protection that we can provide for workers. Again, these are the people who will play the center.
Untuk mengurangi hak-hak mereka, termasuk juga untuk
And the COVID-19 economic recovery, and they need to be prioritized. Many arrangements also take away from the ability of the state to come up with policies, and that is why these agreements needs to be reviewed. We also need to consider eliminating patent protection on essential medication and medicine technology. We understand that there's a great destruction experienced by all humanity when pharmaceutical companies prioritize profit instead. We also hope that we can abolish trade regulations that undermine public services. We have proof that for public goods like energy, water, transportation, it is better for those things to be managed by the state and managed well. Countries with public services that are better are stronger, but some countries actually
berbagai macam bentuk dengan melalui swastanisasi, bisa
public
dengan
goods to the private sector through privatization or public-private partnership. We've seen that this cooperation is actually more harmful. There's higher cost and less assurance or certainty of sustainability. Many of the products have low quality. In addition to that, workers who are working in those companies, they get less protection. So we think that public services and public goods should be the main focus in the economic recovery, not only for COVID-19, but also in general and after COVID. Many current arrangements cannot be halted because of poor dispute resolution regulations. Some agreements and arrangements that are currently in effect actually incur a lot of a loss on the part of state finances, but they are not able to be renegotiated because the country is afraid
negara.
into a dispute resolution process through arbitration and others. One point to help recover the economy is to improve public income. And we need to focus on this is by enacting a tax reform. There are a few types of tax reforms that have been offered, including a wealth tax. Wealth tax is something different from income tax. A wealth tax is imposed upon those who are super wealthy. This is something that is known in some European countries, and the purpose is to narrow the existing economic disparity. This can also help reduce other types of disparities. And this was one idea that was offered for Indonesia to implement as well, because it could reduce disparity without depending upon foreign investments. There's also digital profit tax. We've seen throughout the pandemic, digital has become more important. So this presents its own
Sebagai entitas tunggal. Jadi beberapa perusahaan internasional MNI, MNC banyak mereka
many multinational corporations
tersebar entitasnya. Bahwa sebenarnya mereka satu saja. Mereka
exist in different entities, different legal entities in different countries, but they're actually one giant corporation. They do that to obtain benefit, financial benefit offered by each jurisdiction. There's an idea to have an international tax treating that company as a single entity so that they are not able to evade the tax regulations of other countries. Like utilizing tax havens.
Kita juga seharusnya melihat bahwa mereka punya kewajiban yang harus diberikan. Dan perusahaan-perusahaan ini juga yang seharusnya tidak kita subsidi karena mereka sudah menerima keuntungan.
They also should not benefit from different subsidies.
Kami lihat adalah mengenai reformasi hutang. Selama pandemi ini kita melihat bahwa hutang diberikan.
During the pandemic, we've seen that there's a lot of debt that people take, even though the economic crisis has happened not just because of COVID-19, but irresponsible flow of money, tax evasion, and other things.
Dari semua krisis ekonomi yang terjadi. Beberapa lembaga seperti World Bank atau IMF,
some organizations like the World Bank and IMF has given the dispensation saying that we don't have to pay back the debt within a certain period. But the solution needs to be more fundamental than that. Because the developing countries are still going to bear the burden, and as debitors that were given to them by the richer countries.
Ya, kami melihat bahwa pemulihan pandemi bisa berhasil oleh kaum buruh, tapi apakah kami lagi dibuat untuk membayar atau ada perubahan berarti daripada eksploitasi?
So the economic recovery can be made successful by the laborers, but are the laborers going to be made to pay for that economic recovery? That is a question that we are asking to all of us. Thank you, Mbak Junita, for proposing some ideas that perhaps some of you can take up as political agenda. Things that are in line with our personal politics and preferred policy changes that we can bring into realization in our different committees and groups in the parliament. Maybe the things that we have heard from Junita can be adopted and adjusted and be made political agendas in our respective divisions. And not just social aid, as we've seen.
Insentif untuk para medis ini di budget yang berikutnya.
And entitlements and support, like what our colleagues at the 9th Committee have tried to do. Better protection for certain individuals during the pandemic and after. There's also an emphasis of decarbonizing our economics. And perhaps Tirza can also talk about this. In the Philippines, there is additional budget for paramedics so that they can have mental counseling. We understand that there are some issues such as domestic violence, dropout has increased, stunting as well. What can we do? Can we improve the skills of the paramedics in the regions so that they can also address other mentioned issues? Because the Ministry of the Empowerment of Women and Protection of Children, their work does not reach down to the regions, down to the different localities. So what you can do is you can remind the local government. There's also the letter issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs allowing the local governments to create new posts in their budget for the protection of women and children. If you want the file, you can access it. I've seen many local governments still unaware of this, but this can be used as a reference. You can also seek the assistance of the central government to implement that circular letter of the Ministry of Home Affairs. So we should take advantage of this opportunity. Now, Mas Wahyu, who will be giving us even more options for advocacy in the central and local government.
TKI, P, atau
especially
Mas Wahyu tolong diturunin
to
untuk keluarga rumah
protect
tangga di domestiknya juga.
certain vulnerable
Silakan Mas Wahyu.
people, domestic workers, and migrant workers.
Mbak Eva, terima kasih juga teman-teman di ASEAN Parliamentarian.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, APHR colleagues, and also thank you, Women Caucus colleagues for inviting me in this important discussion. I would like to share about COVID-19 and the future of the protection for vulnerable groups. Since my background is about migrant care, I will discuss more about migrant workers, but I will also touch upon other vulnerable groups because we understand that migrant workers, Indonesian migrant workers, are among the first victims of COVID or coronavirus. We also know that we've just celebrated the first anniversary of COVID-19. We should not wish him or it happy birthday because we don't want it to have a long life, but just we need to realize that we've celebrated the first birthday of the coronavirus. When we were, when all of us were still uh, watching, even some of our high level officials were joking about it, which is actually very hurting if we read now. Our migrant workers were fighting and they were exposed to the virus. They were stigmatized as the carrier, and they also have additional workload, or in the contrary, some of them lost their jobs. The stigma as virus carriers is also supported. I remember last November or December when our migrant workers, because our government also insists uh, to send our migrant workers among the pandemic. In Taiwan, they were then tested positive, and the government of Taiwan rejected them. And now the government of Taiwan no longer wants to take our migrant workers. And nobody said anything. But when our All England athletes couldn't compete because they were seen as carriers, everyone speaks up. So our solidarity level is also very classes. If it is actually experienced by marginal groups, then it's okay. But if it is actually experienced by athlete, all of us also share the same anger. So this is also a reflection for us that actually if we really have a concern on stigmatization, we should also pay equal attention despite who are being stigmatized, including the vulnerable groups. And when the government first conducting evaluation, they were hesitant to evaluate migrant workers. Not evaluation. I think he's talking about repatriation. And so when the government first repatriate Indonesian people, they repatriate students or diplomats, while hundreds of our migrant workers who are working in mainland China were not being evacuated because they are undocumented. They do not have any working permit, even though they have passports. So we also have the dimension of discrimination, which also impact protecting the marginalized
ketika
group.
virus ini menjadi pandemik
And
itu
when this virus turns into a
tekanannya
pandemic,
semakin
the
dalam
vulnerability
misalnya dalam kasus di
becomes
Malaysia.
deeper. For instance,
Malaysia
like
menerapkan
the case
movement
in Malaysia,
darurat
when
sehingga beberapa
Malaysia
nelayan Indonesia kehilangan pekerjaan, kehabisan
implement
logistik
the
pangan
movement
dalam
control
ancaman penangkapan
order,
otoritas Malaysia terhadap
our migrant workers ran out of
kriminalisasi dan
food,
ini yang juga
and they were also threatened to be
teman-teman
arrested
pengungsi
by the
Rohingya atau juga teman-teman
Malaysian
dari
authorities because of their migration
negara
status.
negara
And
yang
even the
karena
Rohingya
situasi
refugees
ini dia harus menjadi
also face the
pengungsi
same
seperti itu.
fate
Nah, pemerintah
because they
Malaysia
have
misalnya
to
karena
take refuge
terkait dengan
elsewhere because of the
kecemburuan fintech ASEAN
internal
itu
problem in
lebih
their
banyak juga
countries.
menggunakan
And the Malaysian
garuda
authorities
dalam
also use a security perspective
penanganan COVID. Dia punya kalau
in
bahasa
handling
terakhir itu
COVID-19.
adalah operasi benteng atau apa gitu ya.
They
Yang
launch different
membantu
operations. The last one is
tentara
actually the
Malaysia
fourth
untuk
operation
menjangkau
with the
perbatasan
police
mereka
and
seperti itu. Dan kemudian
military
ada
in the
pengungsi
far front to
misalnya yang saya kira
close their
sampai
borders.
sekarang juga masih menjadi masalah di Malaysia adalah teman-teman pengungsi Rohingya. Kita tahu
Another problem that we
di
still have
Myanmar
in
sekarang
Malaysia
sampah
is
itu
about the
sangat tinggi.
Rohingya
Nah,
refugees.
pemerintah
We know
Malaysia
that the
seperti
situation in
turut
Myanmar is very
membantu
murky,
mereka.
but
Demikian juga
the
yang dialami oleh
Malaysian authorities still
development
insist
worker
to
kita gitu loh.
deport them.
Jadi
And this is also
dalam
true for
masa
our
misalnya
undocumented migrant
penerapan
workers.
MCO ini juga Malaysia
In
itu
the implementation of
memiliki
MCO,
sangat
Malaysia also used this
3.000
opportunity to deport
pekerja migran kita
tens
yang
of thousands
sebenarnya
of our migrant
adalah pekerja
workers
perdagangan
who are actually victims of trafficking in
manusia
persons.
seperti itu. Nah, balik lagi ke dalam negeri pada
So back to
awalnya
the internal problem.
respon dari
In the
Kementerian
beginning of
Ketenaga
pandemic,
Kerjaan
the
misalnya
response from
melalui
the
dari
MOMT, Ministry of Manpower and Transmigration,
Kemenpan
from their circular number
1 Maret
M2HM01
itu baru
3
penanganan
Romans
pandemi di
2020
sektor
is only
tenaga
on how to
kerjaan
handle pandemic
pekerja
in
migran
the
dan ini
formal
yang
sector.
turunannya sampai kemudian ada subsidi
And
upah
then
untuk pekerja
uh,
formal.
as a result, we have
Nah,
a wage subsidy
tetapi
for
pekerja
formal
migran
workers,
yang lain
but for other
formal
sectors,
itu sama
including
sekali
informal
tidak disentuh
workers,
oleh
they
kebijakan
remain
ini.
untouched by the government
Pekerja-pekerja
policies.
pun ketika baru kami kritik rame-rame oleh
Even
organisasi
the migrant
pekerja
workers,
migran,
only
mereka
after
itu
we,
mengeluarkan Permenaker
CSOs and
ketika
NGOs,
harus mengeluarkan Permenaker 159
criticize this,
penghentian
the
sementara
ministry
penempatan pekerja migran selama masa
open
COVID
a new
yang
or launch a new
sebetulnya
regulation
atas
about
nama new
the
normal, atas
moratorium
nama
on
harusnya
placement
kemudian
of
itu
migrant workers.
dipenuhi,
But then
itu kemudian
uh,
tentang penghentian sementara ini dicabut lagi,
they
diubah
mentioned that
seharusnya
now that we
sementara
are in the new
untuk
normal era,
penempatan pekerja migran di masa kenormalan
the
ini
moratorium
nah itu
was lifted.
prinsipnya kenapa
And
kita mengkritik
the
ini
implication,
memang
so
benar
in the beginning,
kita
we
berpengalaman
criticize this
2002 di
because we say
negara-negara
that
tujuan juga
we haven't experienced a second
situasinya
wave yet,
belum
and the situation in
stabil
the
tetapi kita
destination country
sebagai
is still
pekerja migran
full of uncertainty.
yang
Why
hasilnya
do you
misalnya
want
di
to
Taiwan ditemukan mereka yang
insist on this?
hampir seluruh masa
And
kedatangan pertama
as a
itu
result,
saat diperiksa itu dianggap
like in
positif
Taiwan,
COVID dan malah kemudian implikasinya buruk karena secara permanen sekarang pemerintah Taiwan menutup penempatan pekerja migran
the
di
government of
Indonesia.
Taiwan
Jadi memang
fully closed their
posisinya berat
borders
itu
to
juga
Indonesian.
ketika kita
So
berbicara
COVID-19
tentang
also
hak
opened
pekerja
a
migran di
Pandora
negara
box
negara
on our migrant
maju.
workers
Serta juga
governance,
memperlihatkan
and at
belum
the same
adanya
time
kebijakan yang serius
showcase
bagi pekerja
that there
migran
is
dan
no social protection
terutama
policies
pada
for
saat
migrant workers and
menghadapi
other vulnerable groups
krisis
in
seperti
facing
misalnya
the
pekerja
crisis.
PTTS
For instance,
itu mereka yang terdaftar adalah mereka yang secara administrasi
in
secara
the
hukum
context
itu
of um,
misalnya punya
BPJ,
KTP punya dokumen
those the social security insurance,
misalnya
only those who have identity can enjoy this, while those who do not have identity card, for instance, like the
teman-teman
the
LGBT misalnya,
the
itu juga
non-believers,
masuk
or
karena
actually the
ada eksklusi sosial dalam pengurusan dokumen
LGBTQ group, they still
kependudukan
cannot
itu tidak
have
bisa
any citizenship
dilakukan.
document,
Ini artinya mereka juga terjauhkan
which
dari
means that
akses
they are still
apa
denied of access
perlindungan
and
sosial seperti
protection
itu. Apalagi
and
mereka
social
masyarakat
protection,
adat
not
atau
to mention
kelompok-kelompok
indigenous
terpencil
communities
lainnya. Demikian juga
and
dengan
other
negara
marginalized groups,
tetangga karena
and also migrant
mereka
domestic
sebelum
workers,
mengakui
because the government
pekerja rumah tangga
has not
sebagai
yet
pekerja
acknowledged
formal,
domestic
mereka
workers as
juga tidak
formal
mau
workers.
memastikan ada
They
kebijakan
also
yang
cannot enjoy this
berkelanjutan
policy.
kalau itu
So I
inklusif
think
ya.
we
Inklusi
have a
upah
very good
untuk mereka upahnya di
policy,
bawah berapa 3 juta atau di bawah 6 juta
which is
itu
like a
dikenakan
wage subsidy
per
for those
pekerja yang
who have
mampu.
wages under
Aplikasi
3 or 6 million rupiah.
untuk
But because
basis
the
upah itu hanya
database
BPJS
for this
Kesehatan, sementara kita tahu
wage
bahwa
subsidy is
syarat
from
untuk
the
mendapatkan
social
BPJS
insurance
tenaga kerja
for workers,
itu
BPJS
harus
TK,
ada
and the
perusahaan
requirement
yang
for uh,
seperti itu, sementara penerima
joining BPJS TK is
BPJS
working in the formal sector,
BPJS kesehatan di mana ada sipil
unlike in
penerima bantuan
BPJS Kesehatan or
iuran
health
itu
social health
itu juga
insurance.
belum ada skema itu. Jadi kita berharap sebenarnya teman-teman terutama
So
ya
we
di
hope
Komisi 9
our friends, our colleagues here, especially in
bantuan
Commission
iuran
9,
untuk BPJS
can
Ketenagakerjaan
also
terutama untuk sektor-sektor pekerjaan
make
yang
sure that those who
informal
live
itu
in
juga untuk
informal
teman-teman
or who work in informal
pekerja
sector can also join
migran.
the social
Kita tahu misalnya
insurance
ada
scheme.
kita mendata, kita memantau juga bersama teman-teman
So we also
BPSA
collect
MI
data
itu sudah sekitar 176
with the Migrant Workers
migran
Agency
kita yang pulang ke tanah
that we
air.
have more than
Dan ini adalah
100,000 Indonesian migrant
sesuatu yang
workers returning to
dibandingkan
Indonesia. This is actually the
tahun-tahun
biggest wave of
sebelumnya.
return
Jadi meskipun
compared to previous
kepulangan
years.
mereka ya dihantui oleh stigma pembawa virus, kita tahu
Even though they're
bahwa
being
pada
stigmatized as
eh,
virus carriers,
pernyataan 1 tahun masuknya virus corona ini juga Menteri Kesehatan
even
kita
the Minister of Health
kita kritik karena harusnya dia
were
menyampaikan bahwa
criticized
ada varian baru
because
yang
he should have
masuk ke
communicated about the
Indonesia
new variant coming
diberikan
into
dari
Indonesia,
COVID-19
the new variants which is actually more
menyampaikan
dangerous.
identitas
But
dari pembawa
when he
varian
said
yang
that,
baru
he
itu.
also mentioned about the identity of the
Diantaranya
carrier of this
mereka
new
pekerja migran ada
carrier,
berasal dari Karawang,
migrant workers from Karawang,
dan ini kan potensi untuk menstigma pekerja migran itu
which
masuk
can potentially
tanah
cause
sini.
stigma
Meskipun sebenarnya
to
dalam
the
pemulangan
migrant workers, even
pekerja
though
migran kita buktinya
in the
pemantauan
repatriation,
kami karena
based on
kami bisa
our
menggerakkan
observation,
kartu libur migran sebagai desa tanggap COVID itu belum ada pembentukan klaster penularan
we
COVID-19
found that
ataupun
there is no
penenggelaman pekerja
cluster
migran dari pemulangan itu sendiri.
because of the return of
Nah,
that migrant worker.
pada saat kepulangan itu pekerja migran kita dihadapkan pada pertanyaan apakah mereka
Then
mendapatkan
our
bantuan
migrant
dari
workers,
pengaman sosial dampak
then the
COVID
question is whether or not
atau ada
they
stigma yang diberikan kepada
receive
pekerja migran
the
itu
social
adalah
assistance.
nggak mendapatkan karena mereka
And
tidak
based on
terdaftar
our
dalam DTKS yang menurut Kementerian
an
Sosial itu masih
observation,
aktif
they are not.
pada waktu itu pada waktu rame-rame bansos itu sampai tahun 2015. Jadi teman-teman pekerja migran ini baru
So the migrant workers can only
terkait COVID-19
access
itu melalui
the social assistance
dana desa
program
yang waktu itu diinisiasi oleh
from
Kementerian
the
Desa dan itu sangat
Dana Desa or the Village
bermanfaat.
Fund
Ini yang juga
program.
menjadi inspirasi ya. Saya kira sebulan atau 2 bulan
This is
yang
also
lalu
inspiration
di
for all
seluruh
of us.
Indonesia masyarakat itu
1 year or 2 years ago,
menginisiasi beberapa program
trade union, academicians, and local governments initiated a more comprehensive scheme for social network, which is universal basic income model. We in migrant care, at the end of the second semester last year, piloting the universal benefit program, because in the social assistance for COVID response, we believe that the child protection dimension is lacking. We know that during COVID-19, children are actually kept at home and they are very bored because they have to involve in they're being kept at home, and there's only few assistance given to them or for children protection in general. So we also have the perspective of child rights protection in this social assistance program. So this is something that we are promoting now, which is actually in line with the universal basic income program. We know that 2020 budget, especially the revised version, focuses on economic recovery and social protection. To my knowledge, the allocation of a healthcare fund is very high, and also the allocation of the allocation of social assistance is also high. But the question is there any perspective of protection of migrant workers as well as other vulnerable groups there? So this is something that we also need to make sure, because I think so far what is working is only fiscal stimulus enjoyed by big businesses, but when it comes to SMEs, they cannot enjoy this directly. And we even get a report that in the name of budget refocusing, those who work in prevention of trafficking in persons, and this is what I learned from colleagues in West Tenggara, East Java, and Blitar, the budget for prevention of prevention is actually refocused or reallocated for health sector, even though we understand that they are being exposed to multiple vulnerability. And also for the survivors and victims. We know that our Minister of Foreign Affairs is very active in diplomacy and vaccine politics, but we also want to make sure that the vaccine diplomacy also work to make sure that our migrant workers abroad have access to vaccine in the country where they work for their work safety and security. And we also want to ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs actively working to ensure the safety and security of migrant workers and refugees in the diplomacy, in this COVID-19 diplomacy. And we also see that there's a potential for recovery that
Indonesia ya. Jadi saya lanjut
the
aja.
government of Indonesia failed to identify.
Itu keputusan yang selama ini banyak dipilih oleh pekerja.
Return to the hometown. This is something that
Beban biaya di perkotaan
many
tinggi,
migrant workers choose, or domestic workers also choose, because of loss of income or declining income. Returning to their village, because village can still be relied on for or for living. And mobility to the village also have a risk of transmitting the virus, and soon we will have the Eid holiday, fasting month, and of course this will create a phenomena.
Kesehatan adalah hal yang mutlak. Tapi kita tahu juga desa itu adalah entitas yang sekarang ini dinamis. Gitu.
But at the same time, we also understand that village is a very dynamic entity. So last year, when we had a debate about mudik or about going back to the hometown or going back to the village, the urban knights who are very classist still see that the rural area does not have any ability. But now we have to understand that we have village autonomy.
Terinspirasi dari undang-undang ini. Nah, dalam konteks perlindungan pekerja migran,
And in the context of migrant workers protection, village is also
pekerja migran kalau kita baca di
one of the subject and one of the mechanism to protect migrant workers, which change the characteristic of village from predatory to protector of migrant workers. So actually, if all of the potentials can be maximized, village can serve as social capital to prevent the pandemic. But we have to admit that if we talk about the village law, we only think about the village fund. And the village fund is being robbed for different purposes.
Undang-undang desa seperti itu. Nah, menurut asesmen yang dilakukan oleh Organisasi Perburuan Internasional (ILO), pedesaan dan pekerjaan pertanian adalah pekerjaan yang paling minim terdampak COVID-19. Saya kira ini juga terkonfirmasi ya dari data Susenas, dari data BPS ketika sektor ekonomi yang lain itu minus, tapi ternyata sektor pertanian kita masih.
And we also see that when all of the other sectors are experiencing slowdown, the agriculture sector is still growing.
Tidak revitalisasi ekonomi pedesaan. Nah, itu yang saya kira juga belum terlihat di dalam postur anggaran APBN kita. Belum melihat desa sebagai
But this is not reflected in our state budget. Village are still
yang bisa digenjot untuk pemulihan ekonomi pasca COVID seperti itu. Meski demikian, memang
however,
atau pedesaan sudah terintegrasi pada perekonomian.
Since the rural setting is still is integrated to the global value chain. But now we have inconsistency in the in our agricultural policies. For instance, now we are about to have the harvest season, but we allow for import of rice. So actually, we also want to promote fiscal stimulus.
Pemulihan ekonomi nasional untuk penanganan COVID, untuk dampak COVID itu juga harus salah satunya memprioritaskan pada
And this COVID recovery package is also focused on revitalization of rural area and agriculture sector. The next one is about the potential of remittance. All of these times, all the remittance is only used for consumptive purposes. So our economic recovery program should also ensure that remittance can also contribute to production activities. And lastly, the revitalization should also be able to mitigate the impact of this slowdown in migration of migrant workers abroad, which means that village will be the only hope for the migrant workers who cannot go abroad. That's all from me. Once again, thank you very much.
Makasih Mas Wahyu. Gini teman-teman ya, kita kok merasa kok banyak sekali yang kelewat ya.
Thank you, Mas Wahyu. I think we can feel a little bit like we missed a lot when it comes to different sectors that we need to be protecting. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, because apparently the allocation from our budget for protection is the second lowest or third lowest. So it is no surprise that we could still call for more or an expansion. So don't think of this as mercy or pity, but it's actually a future investments. Mas Wahyu Susilo stated that the local governments have been overwhelmed because the migrant workers go back and then their contracts have not been extended. This has happened as well internally or domestically, where our domestic workers have gone back to their homes and not continue their contracts, or maybe they are furloughed or fired by their employers. So the villages find it challenging to provide social protection. So we need to find ideas to respond to situation that have occurred because of the pandemic, but things that might have been missed earlier, so that all the different issues that we are talking about now can be new forms of social protection, but
unproductive expenditure. Karena in the long run, in the long term,
the trap of thinking that these are non-productive expenditure, because these things actually improve the productivity. Like our children are quite stressed, they're under pressure. I even called a psychologist to consult on these issues, because at one point my child didn't want to do anything, didn't want to do their homework because of Zoom fatigue. So I think this is the obligation of mothers to demand a new form of social protection, as was suggested and recommended by Mas Wahyu. Other, like in working for the issue of women, are also talking about the same thing. They're talking about whether we can have aid given to legal aid can be marked for women, because women are more vulnerable to violence and stress. So I see that this morning we have been given an expanded horizon that we need to have better social protection schemes from the central government to the regions, because a lot of people are missing out based on the experience of people who are working in the field. And the agenda of KPPRI, the Women's Caucus, has become a more or heavier because we are really depending upon the women's politicians, because I think the men, I'm not sure that I think it would be difficult for them as well, but we hope for a positive change, and it is time for us to show the people that women can play a substantive role in changing policies through the parliament space, together with people who are working out in the field. So please network with different people. So that's what I mean. So the last one, Tiza will be completing a series of presentations, and hopefully we can see the different agendas that we can adopt as group agendas, personal agendas, things that we fight for on a daily basis to change our politics and policies. Right. I'd like to introduce Tiza is an expert in climate financing. So perhaps we can talk about budgeting as well. Thank you, Miss. Thank you, Ibu Eva Sundari. Also, my regards to the Apitaloka, Laudi Sharif, Pak Wahyu, and Mbak Junita, speakers before me. Thank you so much allowing me to share my screen. I will talk about green economy for economic recovery. My name is Tiza Mafira. I'm the Associate Director of a research body, which is the Climate Policy Initiative. We're a climate research office. We have offices in 6 locations around the world. We focus on the different initiatives to address the climate crisis. Today, we will talk more about the fiscal stimulus policy, and I think the different speakers before me have talked a lot about this as well, or have mentioned this issue. I will start with this quote. Our finance minister was appointed this year to be the co-chair of a very prestigious coalition, which is Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. They will meet later. And one of the part of the manifesto of this coalition is the finance ministers have agreed that it is now very important for all countries to have the fiscal stimulus packages that can put in the forefront economic recovery in
back better, ya. Nah, kemudian
it is better. The term that is used is to build back better. So in terms of quality, content, and substance, needs to put forward economic and environmental interests for the interests of decades to come. So economic and environmental outcomes are considered to be equally important for us to pay attention to, because we want to have an economy that not only has growth but also resilient, meaning that with whatever crises that we face, it can be resilient, it can bounce back. And the pandemic as a crisis is just one of the type of crisis that we face and we will be facing. There's another crisis, there are crises that we can predict and others we cannot. Even for those that are predictable, like the climate crisis, something that we can predict since a long time ago, we really cannot predict when it will occur, which date, which month or year, when can we have flooding or drought that will destroy our food crops. This is not something that we can predict. So we have to constantly be ready and design an economy that is resilient to shocks. the climate crisis can be worse than the COVID crisis. We now know that many countries in the world have experienced a recession, including Indonesia. But there are estimations and projections that show that the climate crisis will generate an even greater recession. Projection for 2060 shows that the Southeast Asia will experience the heaviest blow because of the crisis. This image, you can see the green bar that goes down the most, that represents the decline of the GDP for South and Southeast Asia. In Indonesia and in other countries, all of the countries experienced the COVID-19 pandemic by issuing fiscal stimulus packages. Most of these stimulus packages are stimulus for the health sector, social sector, business sector, and the majority of them have been given without due consideration for the environment. Climate Policy Initiative has undertaken a study to look at the stimulus packages issued in 5 countries: Indonesia, India, Singapore, South Korea, and the Philippines. Indonesia has only a small part of the package that is relevant to the environment and has a pro-green effect. So in the table below, on the bottom, the stimulus package is 700 trillion rupiahs, and only part of it, which is 9 to 10% relevant, doesn't mean that it is promotes the environment. And from 69% has a negative effect on the environment, only 4% has a positive effect on the environment. So only 4% green and 96% dirty. The Philippines doesn't even have a green relevant, environmentally relevant stimulus, even though the dirty part is not so huge. So,
oleh karena itu lumayan besar porsi stimulus mereka yang bagus untuk,
and that's why they have a huge part of their stimulus that is green. In areas that is the European Union, they set aside 25% from their stimulus for green investments. They explicitly say that the stimulus can generate 1 million new jobs in the low emission sector, 100,000 jobs in the circular economic sector. So they are very forward looking, and they're looking to expand the employment in areas or sectors that will be trending in the future. Now, going deeper to the PEN in Indonesia, the National Economic Recovery, there are environmentally relevant aspects. Their agriculture, energy, industry, transport, and waste. The PEN has been dispersed for energy and transportation. Not many of them have been channeled to agriculture or waste. Even those that have been channeled to energy and transportation, less than 50% of them have been distributed to the green energy sector. Others are the coal, oil, and gas. In transportation, also not even half are given to green transportation. For example, part of the PEN have been used for the corporate financing of Garuda Indonesia. Garuda is not considered a green transportation company. But there are some positive impacts of the PEN for the environment. And this is something that we need to explore further and look for opportunities to expand them. For example, there's the investment in the National Power Company, PLN, for a new power plant in Papua and Kalimantan, and financing directed to public
Ada juga
public
misalnya
transportation.
biodiesel, walaupun nanti biodiesel ini agak sedikit kontroversi ya, seperti rekan-rekan pasti
There's
mengetahui.
also some issues with biodiesel. It is quite problematic. It really depends on the basis for the fuel, whether they contribute to deforestation or not.
Proses pembakaran biodiesel juga masih menghasilkan
And
emisi gitu.
the burning of biodiesel also,
Dalam kategori energi baru dan terbarukan, maka di sini masuk ke dalam.
but it is included in the category of new and renewable energies.
Sebenarnya di paket pemulihan ekonomi nasional.
In our national economic recovery packages, the sectors that are addressed are those that support business and health. But from the 6 sectors here, if we look at them more closely, the purpose of the PEN is actually to maintain supply and demand so that the demand can still be high by providing social protection, different subsidies, direct cash assistance, so that the people can still have some purchasing power. There's also support on the supply side to promote production activities. Now, actually, from these two sides, from the demand and the supply sides, there's the potential for PEN to support investments that is green. For example, from the subsidy aspect, there's a program from the Energy Ministry, so the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, to redirect some of the power subsidy for poor households to purchasing solar panels, so that the funds that are spent is the same, so it would not generate more burden on the part of the government, but it's redirected so that people can still have electricity, but electricity from solar panels. So that is one example of how PEN can still have an expanded environmentally relevant stimulus. And in other parts, such as interest rate, improvement of investments, or working capital grants and tax incentives, they can still be designed so that they can be given to green industries, or given more to green industries such as renewable energies, and or instead to petrochemicals, but to recycling industries. So there are options available. But to improve it to more than 4%, we need to make it more explicit that they are meant to support green industry.
Sehingga kebetulan ada beberapa sektor-sektor energi hijau
It is
yang
quite generic, that allows the green industries to obtain some benefit from the PEN. Imagine what happens when the PEN is designed and actually determined so that parts of it, a certain percentage, is given to green economy. We'll see a major increase then in green environmentally relevant stimulus. This has to do with the economics. We've seen from the perspective of the environment, but the environment is also an economic matter. economic growth must be divorced, detached, disconnected from the use of resources. The less our economy is dependent upon a fluctuating supply chain, the better. This shows the fluctuation of the price of coal and oil for the past 2 decades. You can see that coal is very fluctuating. It also increased 4 times between 2010 and 2000 and 2008, 3.5 times in 2011. And when it fell, we also had some negative effects. Even some areas also went into a recession because they were coal production areas. Oil also fluctuated. It's raised, it risen and fell 2 to 3 times during the same period. But now let's compare solar panels. As if you can see the purple line, that is the price of solar panels. And the other colors, I'd like to show you the light green. The light green is Indonesia. The others are other countries in in Southeast Asia. The light green is the levelized cost of electricity. In 2019, you can see that it is only slightly different from or compared to average solar panel. But in the future, the projection is the purple line continues to drop, but the green line is maintained. It even is elevating a little bit. The orange line, which is Singapore, their cost is much higher compared to solar panels. So does this mean that without us doing anything,
karena harganya turun terus,
because their price is going to continue to decline, so we won't have to do anything and it will be popular in Indonesia? Not exactly, because there are hindrances that are non-market. It can cause market failures. It can cause that even though the price of solar panels have become competitive, but it will not be able to penetrate the Indonesian market. Why? Because of policies such as the National Economic Recovery that still provides subsidy for coal power or diesel. Imagine an island in the eastern part of the country. They will actually obtain more benefit if they have solar panels. So the sun shines bright there, and the solar panel actually has a competitive price, but they are still accepting diesel in a huge amount that is subsidized. So that causes a price distortion, and the price of solar panels cannot be competitive. So we need to remove those regulatory impediments that causes renewable energy to be less competitive. I took a glance of the manifesto of parliamentarians that was mentioned by Teddy and mentioned by FI. I think this is so good. I included some of them here in the slide, that they want to put forward economics that can maintain the temperature to be less than 1.5%. And all of the COVID-19 and economic crisis handling measures to not weaken but strengthen environmental protection. So this is an opportunity for us to take advantage of, and to include in the stimulus spending greater financial incentives for renewable energy and zero emissions technology. This is also good, but pay attention to the words. It's renewable energy, not a new energy, and zero emission technology, not clean technology. And there's a difference. So renewable energy and zero emissions technology, they do not produce emissions at all, and that is good. But the problem is in Indonesia, there are still a lot of people who are promoting what is called clean emissions, like biodiesel, as I said before, or all clean coal technologies like DMA, which is the derivative of coal that can replace LPGs, also liquefied gas, also waste to energy that still produces
Teknologi yang zero emissions. Untungnya Indonesia.
So they're included in the category of clean, but not really zero emissions. Fortunately, Indonesia has the high potential of using solar panels. Even when we see the study of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, they actually have identified that the Indonesia's highest potential is not from geothermal, but solar power. Unfortunately, the solar panel still has not penetrated the Indonesian market. And this is something that we need to promote, which is renewable energy and zero emissions technology. Number three from the manifesto is to establish conditions for economic support for the private sector so that they can reduce pollution, emissions, and waste and other environmentally detrimental effects. And this is often called green conditions or green strings attached that we cannot find in our current PEN. There are no conditions, there are no requirements for PLN, the National Power Company, or Garuda, the flagship airline, or other companies. I can give you fiscal incentives, but reduce your emissions. There's nothing like that. In other countries, they do have these green conditions. I now arrive at the conclusion. The first is we can see the data in 2020 that the fiscal stimulus in other countries in the beginning of the pandemic, they are designed to focus on the improvement of social sector, business, and health. So it's still within the emergency mindset. Let's rescue and let's think about recovery later. Rescue first, recover later. But now going into the 2021, this is the time for us to think about midterm and long-term recovery, especially when we're already rolling out the vaccination. So we cannot just think about rescue and rescue in the long term. When we think about midterm and the long term, we have to think about proportions dedicated to the green sector. And that is the second conclusion. Part of the PEN has supported the attainment of green development, and this shows that it can do that, but the green mandates have to be more explicit. The PEN has the flexibility for the program implementation, and it can be developed further to promote investment in green sectors and the application of green conditions. Number three, fiscal stimulus is not the only economic instrument that we have. There are others as well. But this is a strong policy signal. All of the countries are focusing on the fiscal stimulus. Globally, it reaches 15 trillion US dollars. That is a huge, enormous amount. And people are checking one another. What's your stimulus composed of? And this is a strong signal where people can judge how serious are we and addressing climate crisis, food crisis, and other issues. The last, there are other policy plans, and something that for me, that is
dan perlu
more
kita kawal dengan serius adalah kebijakan jangka panjang seperti carbon pricing
um,
dan mengurangi dan menghilangkan
I feel
fossil fuel, menghilangkan subsidi batu bara minyak
carbon pricing and phasing out of the fossil fuel subsidy. This potentially can add fiscal capacity and investments in green sector. So that's all, ladies and gentlemen. That's all from me, and hopefully we can have a good discussion in the Q&A. Thank you, and greetings and may peace be upon you.
Terima kasih, Pak. Saya mau share ya. Itu di
Thank you, Miss. I'd like to share something in Tulu Agung. There's small and micro enterprise that can produce power poles that can have solar panels above them.
berdasarkan solar panel ini. Dan kalau sore langsung menyala. Nah, saya itu berpikir ya, seandainya beberapa
So they can turn on automatically during the night. And I hope that all of you can pressure the local government to use these different initiatives. Then it would be a good stimulus in the local government for investments in clean energy or these renewable energies. So there is some potential, but we need to change the mindset and advocate for budgeting that is pro green industry. And I think this is also good for the environment, because apparently there are 2 million muskrams because of pollution. So if we see in the villages, if you are still using firewood for cooking, this is something that can be inhaled, that can cause higher child mortality. So women can support clean energy because of their health effects as well. So this is something that we can combine. So pro-environment considerations can also improve our advocacy for the fulfillment of the right to health of women and children. So we can actually, they have them go together. And I hope this can provoke us this morning to think about that the future after the pandemic can be better than before, especially for pro-environment, pro-minority, pro-women, and pro-children aspects. So this is something that is offered or as an opportunity, which is called the local incentive fund, something that can be applied for by the local government if they have programs for gender equality and the environment. So the local politicians can start talking to the local governments about these things, and there's an opportunity to take funds from the central government. So there's an offer here so that we can move towards development agendas that are pro the environment. So that is my response. So you can start thinking about how we can contribute to resolving
oleh para panelis mulai pagi sampai
and presented by the panelists from the morning earlier, and take them up as political agendas. If they are merely moral commitments, they will not go anywhere. They need to be political agendas that you can take up in the parliament or in your political parties or in civil society. we're done with the presentation. Also, two remarks, including by Ibu Dia. Ibu Dia actually has an appointment with the mayor of Bogor, talk about some issues, and this is the only opportunity because it's during the weekend. If not during the weekend, they cannot meet with people outside of Jakarta. We'll open for Q&A from all of you. You can press the raise hand or type your questions in the chat. I hope some of you have questions already.
Just raise your hand and then turn on your microphone.